Good morning and welcome to the first of today's webinar. I hope you're all well rested. This one is to do with the nervous system and will help you with completion of LO8, your eighth learning outcome. If you have looked at the workbook, you'll see there's only 4 questions. It's quite a nice short workbook to complete. As per usual, if you do have any questions, do stop and ask me. Other than that, please remain muted so there's no feedback. And again, if you do see me pause, that's just to let somebody else in, okay? So, nervous system, the learning outcomes. Incidentally, this probably won't take up the full hour. There's only about 26 slides, something like that, okay? So, learning outcomes by the end of the lesson, you will be able to describe the role and functions of the nervous system, describe the principles of muscle contraction, explain the all or nothing law, and identify how exercise can enhance neuromuscular connections and improve motor fitness. So let's look at the structure of the nervous system. And as you can see, I've labeled these 1 through to 6, so we'll look at them individually. The nervous system acts as a communication center for all electrical and chemical messages sent throughout our body. When we talk about chemical messages, we're talking about things like hormones. So hormones, estrogen, testosterone, that kind of stuff. Even though they're part of the endocrine system, they are very much linked to the nervous system. So let's look at the structure. So initially we have the very first part is the central nervous system, okay, which is the brain and spinal cord. Each of these we're going to look at individually. So the central nervous system, anytime you see CNS written in anatomy and physiology, it just stands for central nervous system. That's the brain and spinal cord. Then we have the peripheral nervous system. So that's all the nerves that come off the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system itself is then subdivided into 2 sections. We have the somatic nervous system, which pretty much affects your muscles. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which again, we're going to, sorry, let me just let this person in. Again, we're going to look at that separately, but the autonomic nervous system, you might recall from last week, we used the word autonomy, and that's the part of the nervous system that has complete control of itself. So it functions without our conscious thought. The autonomic nervous system is itself subdivided into 2 sections. We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And again, we're going to look at each of these separately. Okay? So central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord. Then you have the peripheral nervous system, that's the nerves that come off the spinal cord. That's further divided into the somatic, which is for the muscles, and the autonomic, which is for pretty much everything else, blood vessels and internal organs. And that is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And as I said, we're going to look at those individually. So the role of the nervous system. To sum up the role of the nervous system, it is quite simply to gather information, which is sensation, analyze the gathered information, which is called integration, and then respond appropriately to the information, which is called a response. So an example of gathering information is, let's say you touch something that is hot. Okay, so that sensation has to be sent to the spinal cord. Okay, spinal cord or the brain then determines what needs to be done, it's called integration, and then it's going to send a signal through to your muscles, causing your muscle to pull away from that hot object. Okay, and that's called a response. So that's to do with something like heat. It could just be touch. Okay, so when you feel a touch, that's going to be sensation. If you get chemical irritation, okay, again, that's going to be an example of sensation. And then the integration is where the brain or spinal cord determines what action you need to take, and then the response is whatever that response is. Okay, it could be things like your hair standing on end. It could be you moving away. It could be your pupils dilating. Okay, it could be your heart rate increasing. Okay, so those are all examples of responses. Let's go back to that previous slide where we looked at the structure of the nervous system. Let's see if you can remember those 6. So remember, number 1, that's the big thing, the main part of your nervous system. And remember, when answering these, just keep it to yourself. No need to vocalize your answer. So we had the central nervous system. Like we said, remember we said that was the brain and spinal cord. And then coming off that was the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. That was subdivided into two sections. Can you remember either of those? The one to do with the muscles, that was your somatic nervous system. And then the other part that has got control of itself. Okay, so that's the autonomic. And then that was further subdivided into two sections, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, that is subdivided into somatic and autonomic. And then the autonomic is divided further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, and again, we're going to look at each of these separately. And again, from the slide just before that one, and we recall the role, the three main roles of the nervous system. So gathering information, can you remember what that was for? That's sensation. Analyzing that gathered information. And that was integration. And then responding appropriately to that information. And that was called a response. Okay, so sensation, integration, and response. So I did say we're going to look at each of these separate parts, but not in great detail, because remember, it's just a level 2. So the central nervous system is the control base of the whole nervous system. Nerve impulses sent to the central nervous system stimulate our muscles to contract and create movement. And as we have said here, it says the central nervous system, the CNS, consists of the brain and spinal cord. And if it wasn't immediately obvious, this picture is a representation of a person. It looks like a man by the build. Obviously, this is the brain, this is the spinal column, and within it is the spinal cord. So remember, the spinal cord sits within the spinal column. Okay? And then all these other yellow bits coming off it, they're going to be examples of the peripheral nervous system. I'm going to come to, I think, in the next slide. Okay, so central nervous system is going to be the brain and the spinal cord that is housed and protected by the spinal column, the vertebrae of the spinal column. Peripheral nervous system. So again, if we look at the picture first, so remember we said the brain, and the yellow coming all the way down the center here is the spinal cord, and then all those other yellow strands, okay, they're examples of peripheral nerves. So the peripheral nerves consist of nerves, receptors, and effector organs that lie outside the brain or spinal cord. So what that means, okay, so receptors, they are the parts of the body that actually pick up sensation. Okay? So it could be sensation of heat, it could be sensation of touch, it could be pressure, it could be pain. So there's a receptor to pick up those signals. Okay. And then when it says effector organs, these will be things like muscles, for example, that will respond to that signal. So in the early example, I talked about if you touch something that's hot and you get a signal back to your muscle to pull your arm away, so a muscle will be an example of an effector organ. Okay. The neurons of the peripheral nervous systems are sensory, also known as effectors, and they carry message to the central nervous system. And then we have motor neurons called effectors, and they carry messages away from the central nervous system. So it's even though the nervous system is quite complex, it is fairly simple as well, in as much as you have neurons that take sensation to the spinal cord, that the spinal cord can pick up on what the signal is, and then you get a neuron from the spinal cord back to an organ telling it what to do. Okay, so again, still using muscle as an example, seeing that we're going to be personal trainers and we're going to be focusing mostly on people's muscles. Again, if I have like sticking with the pain one, if you jab my hand with a needle, okay, then the sensory neuron is going to pick up that signal and send that signal to the spinal cord and onto the brain. The brain will decide what that sensation is, and then it's going to send a signal through what we call motor neurons back to that muscle, cause me to pull away. Okay, so it's simple in that respect. Okay, sensation to brain and spinal cord, a signal back to the muscle, telling the muscle to contract. Okay, so yeah, so sensory neurons, also known as incidentally, your neurons are your nerves. So sensory nerves or sensory neurons are the same thing. Sorry, sensory cells, not nerves, cells. Okay, so your neurons are your nerve cells. Okay? In the same way that we have muscle fibers are muscle cells, neurons are nerve cells. Okay? So sensory receptors provide feedback on internal and external environments. So, for example, muscle spindles will sense muscle length. So let me just explain that. Within your muscles, at various parts, you have what we call muscle spindles. They respond to a change in the length of a muscle. Okay? So if you're doing a stretch, for example, and you say, "Oh yeah, I can feel that stretch," that's your muscle spindle sending a signal to the central nervous system, telling the central nervous system that the muscle is being stretched. You then get a signal from your brain back to that muscle, causing it to contract. It's like a protective mechanism. Okay, that's called a stretch reflex. Okay, so the sensory receptor in that instance is a muscle spindle. Okay, so you stretch the muscle spindle itself becomes stretched. It sends a signal to the central nervous system. Okay, that's a sensory input, and then you get a motor response from the central nervous system back to that muscle, causing it to contract, and that's that discomfort you feel when you stretch. And you say, "Yeah, I can feel that stretch," and that's a stretch reflex. Okay. Then you have your effector organs, so they carry out the action as directed by the central nervous system, okay, via motor neurons. So, for example, a muscle. So again, the muscle is the one that's going to be responding. That's called your effector organ. Okay. So to summarize that, sensory receptors will pick up a sensation, be it stretch, be it pressure, be it heat, be it touch, whatever it is. It sends a signal via your sensory neurons to the central nervous system. The central nervous system will then send signals via motor neurons, these ones here, to the effector organ, causing that effector organ to do whatever it needs to do. Okay? So that's, in a summary, your peripheral nervous system. Now, I'm just going to go back, just give you a few seconds just to look over this to see how much of this you can remember, because the next slide is going to be just a little revision. Nerves, receptors, effector organs, sensory and motor neurons, sensory receptors, and effector organs. They will be perhaps the main terms that we're going to have to consider here. Okay, so peripheral nervous system consists of, and remember these letters that you see in the boxes, they're the first letter of the missing word. So nerves, receptors, and effector organs that lie outside the brain or spinal cord. And the neurons, which are your nerve cells, the neurons of the peripheral nervous system are sensory neurons and motor neurons. Okay? You've probably heard the term motor neuron disease. So with a motor neuron disease, somebody with that, their brain, the neurons, the motor neurons that come from the spinal cord aren't able to send the signals to the muscles for the muscle to contract. So someone with motor neuron disease has difficulty with their coordination and mobility because they're not getting sufficient signals back to their muscles from the brain, okay, and the spinal cord. So that's your motor neuron disease. Sensory receptors and effector organs. Okay, so for example, muscle. So the subdivisions, remember we said the peripheral nervous system was further divided. Okay, so we have the somatic and the autonomic. So if we look at the somatic first, so controls of voluntary, and this is an important bit, voluntary conscious movement. For example, we're talking about skeletal muscle. Where the autonomic controls involuntary systems of the body, for example, digestion. Now, we did say last week when we touched on autonomy, it's important that we have parts of the body that work autonomously. Autonomously means under their own control, okay? Because if we had to consciously think about getting certain body parts to work, if we're not thinking about them, that means they wouldn't work. So if I had to think about my heart working or my digestive system working, If I had to think about them, but then I got distracted, then obviously there's going to be a bit of a problem. So we need to have a system in place that allows certain body parts to function without our conscious thought. Okay? Also, if you're sleeping, you're not thinking about those things. It's very important that we have this. And that's what your autonomic nervous system does. It allows certain structures, certain organs to be able to function when you are not conscious without any input from you. Okay. And that's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. This system is further divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic is often known as the war or the fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic is known as the peace or rest and digest. Okay, so let me give you some examples of this. With the sympathetic nervous system, some of the things it does is under stressful circumstances, let's say you're facing danger, it will dilate your pupils so you can see better. It will increase your heart rate so you can pump more blood around the body, okay, so that you can supply the body with more ATP. It will shut down your digestive system because in the event that you're fighting or fleeing or whatever, you don't need to be digesting food. Okay. It will enhance your hearing as well. Okay? It will increase your blood pressure so that blood can be pumped around to the muscles more effectively. So those are the kind of things that the sympathetic nervous system does. And the parasympathetic nervous system does pretty much the opposite. Okay. So once let's say you're playing a sport, pretty much all those things that I mentioned before will be enhanced by your sympathetic nervous system to allow you to compete. Okay. Dilated pupil, enhanced hearing, increased blood pressure, increased heart rates, increased muscle tone, all that kind of stuff, so you can perform a lot better. At the end of your activity, you need to come back to balance. You can't be in a state where everything's all charged up all the time. So that's what your parasympathetic nervous system will do. It brings you back down to balance. So it'll bring the pupils back to normal. It will lower that heart rate. It will reduce the muscle tone. So it just brings you back to your nice, relaxed, balanced state. Okay? It's also known as rest and digest, and it's best because it promotes digestion. So remember, we said this with the sympathetic, it's going to shut down your digestive system because you don't need to be using up the valuable energy digesting food if you've got to fight or if you've got to flee. Okay, that's a lot of wasted energy. So it shuts that down. But the parasympathetic nervous system that's going to promote digestion, which is why if you are eating, it's always best to be consuming food when you are nice and chilled. Because when you're nice and chilled, that's when the parasympathetic nervous system is going to promote digestion. If you're eating when you're stressed and on the go, your digestive system is not functioning properly because it's been shut down by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So let's see if we can fill in those missing words. Again, those letters there represent the first letter of the missing word. The peripheral nervous system divided into two sections. We have the somatic and the autonomic. And the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the structure of a neuron. So remember, the neurons are your nerve cells. And before we look at the structure, let me just talk a little bit about this thing here. So within your nerves, okay, remember, nerves and neurons aren't the same thing. Okay, neurons are what make up the nerve. So remember, nerves and neurons are not the same thing. Neurons make up the nerves. So this is just an example of one neuron, and what you would have within a nerve is loads, thousands of these stacked end to end. So the next neuron, if we call this the head of the next neuron will be attached down here. Okay, and you just have loads of these in series. You'll have one above and above and above. And you have loads going down and down and down and down and down. Okay, and a whole chain of neurons will form your nerve. Okay, now if you think of a nerve as a electric cable, so I just think of a nerve as an electric cable. And for those of you who don't know, within an electric cable, you have at least 3 wires. Okay? So now if you imagine this electric cable, that would be your nerve. But rather there being 3 wires in there, there are thousands of wires. Okay? Those wires that are within the electric cable, they will be your neurons. Okay? So the whole thing here, the cable itself is going to be the nerve, but the neurons, which are thousands of them, stacked side by side and lengthwise, all those neurons, they're going to be like the electric individual cables that are within here. Okay. Okay, cool. So let's look at the actual structure of your neuron. Excuse me. So you have dendrites, so they carry action potentials. That's just nerve electrical energy, electrical impulses. That's what action potential is. So the action potential, the electrical signals come along here into the dendrites. You have the axon, which transmits the action potential. So the axon, which is this structure along here, transmits that electrical signal along its length. You have a myelin sheath. So these bits here is your myelin sheath. Okay, let's see if I've got arrows. No, I haven't. So you've got your myelin sheath. Now, what the myelin sheath does, it allows the electrical signal to be transmitted quicker. Okay, so rather than the electrical signal traveling along the entire length here, what it does, it jumps. Okay, so when the electrical signal jumps, it's traveling a lot quicker. Most neurons have these myelin sheaths, but not all of them. Okay. You have the axon terminal. Okay, so the axon terminals are here. So where the axon comes to an end, it then divides. You have the synaptic end bulbs. Okay, so these expanded bits here, they're called synaptic end bulbs, and they contain a neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter, when it's released, it then has an impact on the next cell. Okay. The nucleus, okay, so that's like your control center. So think of that almost like the brain of the neuron, if you like. And this whole region here is called the cell body. Okay, so your cell body with the nucleus, dendrites coming off it. You have an axon, and then that divides into axon terminals. You have the synaptic end bulbs, and then along the length of the axon, you have these myelin sheath. Now, neurons don't all look like this. Some of them have, this is called a unipolar, so there's only one axon. You'll have bipolar as well, where you might have 2 axons. Multipolar, which have more than 2 axons. So they don't all look like this. But in anatomy, this is typically the one that you'll see represented. Okay, so your dendrites, these strands that come off here, the axon, which is the long one that comes all the way down there, the myelin sheath, which insulates the axon and allows for quicker transportation of the electrical signal. The axon terminals, which are strands that come off the bottom of the axon. Synaptic end bulbs, which contains a neurotransmitter, which helps determine what is the action of the next neuron. The nucleus, which is like the control center, and the cell body. Yeah. Okay. So, not expecting you to remember all of that. You might remember some of it. So let's see how much of that you can remember. Okay, so these the D was your dendrites, so these little strands here. What was the A word that described the long one that comes all the way down here? Okay, so that's going to be your axon. Then these sheaths here begins with an M, protected to allow quicker transmission of the electrical signal. That's your myelin sheath. This bit here where the actually no, I was just about to give away the next answer. They're the long strand. Sorry, the separated bits at the end of your axon. That's your axon terminals. The bits here that release a transmitter. We've gone to the top right-hand side. Sorry, we've gone to the top right-hand side. So the nucleus regulates the cell activity. Here's the end. That's your nucleus, which is your control center. And coming down here, we have, what do we have here? Your S. Okay? That's your synaptic end bulbs, and that's where the chemicals, the neurotransmitters come out, and they have an effect on whatever the synaptic end bulb attaches to. It could be another neuron, or it could be something like a muscle fiber. Okay. I think I'm right in saying that this question comes up in your workbook. I think so, to do with a motor unit. So before we look at what a motor unit is, let's just look at this picture. This picture here shows you a neuron. So if you go to the previous one, a neuron. Remember, these are your dendrites, the cell body, the nucleus, the axon, and the myelin sheath. And these here are muscle fibers. This is just a representation of muscle showing you a muscle fiber here. Okay. So a motor unit is a motor neuron and the muscle fibers it innervates. It's as simple as that. A motor unit is a motor neuron and the muscle fibers it innervates. And we have different size motor units. So we have larger motor units. They will have an effect on your more powerful muscles. So things like your quadriceps, your hamstrings, your pecs. Okay. And then we have small motor units. They will affect the muscles in your forearms to allow for dexterity. Now, the reason why we have this kind of with the large motor units, you'll have a motor neuron, but it will be in control of a wider range of motor fibers, of muscle fibers, whereas your small motor unit will be in control of a smaller number of muscle fibers. Okay, so remember, the only way a muscle fiber can contract is when it gets a stimulation from the nerve. So if a single nerve or single neuron rather is stimulating a wide number of muscle fibers, then you're going to get a bigger contraction. If a single neuron is stimulating a small number of muscle fibers, you get a smaller contraction. So that's why we have for the fingers, because of dexterity, we have a smaller motor unit. Whereas, like I said, the bigger, powerful muscles, they have a bigger motor unit. So with the powerful muscles, each neuron controls a wider number of muscle fibers. Okay. So we did touch on this very briefly last week. We looked at the structure of a myofibril. Okay. So remember we talked about myofibril. When viewed under microscope, the muscle fiber has a striped structure. Okay, and that's what we've seen here, the striated structure. Okay. And we talked about the sarcomere, that's a unit of contraction. So what we have here is a representation of a myofibril, okay? And the myofibril is made up of myofilaments. So a sarcomere is from one Z disc, so that's that zigzaggy bit here, to another. And then what you'd have another one of these either side, or so a load of these either side, and another set of these going either side. So if you think about an entire muscle fiber, and the entire length of a muscle fiber is made up of thousands of these sarcomeres. It's stacked length. So your sarcomere is from one Z disc to another. The myofibril is made of thick filaments known as myosin, which in this diagram is going to be represented by the dark red, and thin filaments called actin, which is the thinner lines that you see here. And then just like in last week's slide, this is just another version, or a better view if you like, showing you pretty much more the structure of what these things look like. So your thick filament has these expanded bits at the end, and then they make contact with the thin filaments, and they pull the thin filaments in towards the center line here. And when that occurs, that's when the muscle is contracting, okay? And that's called a sliding filament theory. I'm going to show you in a couple of slides, or maybe the next one. So in a couple of slides, I'm going to show you a video. I'm hoping that you can hear what the woman is saying. If you can't hear what she's saying, let me know, and then I'll send you the link to the video, because the video will help you understand muscle contraction a lot more than me just showing you still pictures. Okay, so remember your unit of contraction called a sarcomere is from one Z disc to another, and between the Z disc you have a thick filament called myosin and a thin filament called actin. And what happens here is that these expanded bits on the thick filament, they will attach to the thin filament and form what's called a cross bridge. Okay, so that's what anytime you see the term cross bridge, that refers to the joining of these expanded parts of the myosin to the actin. So we've got 7 slides here that's going to show you exactly how this works. I'll do it slowly first, and then I'll speed it up. So as a result of ATP, these expanded bits on the actin, sorry, on the myosin heads, they start to stand up. They then attach to the actin, that's called a cross bridge. They then pull the actin in. So you see how pulling it in, it's got smaller, and it pulls it in further, and it keeps on making contract and keeps pulling it in until the sarcoma is totally shortened, and that's a muscle contraction. Okay, so if you noticed, these Z discs, that's what the blue represents, the Z disc, they were getting closer, and this gap here was getting shorter. Okay, so that's the muscle contraction. So if I was to see if I can speed that up, so okay, so that's it. And then when you're stretching muscle, this is what happens. Okay, it undoes itself. It's your muscle contraction. The myosin heads stand up. They make contract with the actin. They pull the actin in, keep on making contract, keep pulling it in like grappling hooks. The sarcoma shortens. That's muscle contraction. Okay. So rather than going through this particular slide, which is a bit complicated, I'm going to see if I can play this video. So first off, I'm just going to. Okay, so first of all, I need to stop sharing. I'm going to disconnect my headphones because I have a feeling that you won't hear this with my headphones on. So just let me come out of this first. Disconnect my headphones. Let me just disconnect my headphones. Okay, go back to sharing. So, can you hear this?
Can't hear anything.
But can you hear it all?
No.
You're not hearing it? No, okay. Okay. Okay, let me just stop that then. Okay, so I'm just going to stop this. Stop sharing that. I'm going to come back to sharing that. Oops, where are you guys going? All right, just give me 1 second. I'm just going to come back to this slide. All right, so let me just attach my headphones back again. Bluetooth. So I'm just putting, just so you know, I'm just putting my headphones back in. Great. All right, and then go back to sharing. Okay, so what I'm going to do, you guys can hear me, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to send you the link to this particular slide because it's YouTube video, because it actually is a very, very good video to help you understand sliding filaments. Okay, but very briefly, what I'm going to say is that you have a couple of structures called troponin, tropomyosin, and we've got calcium. Calcium is extremely important for muscles to contract. Okay, so again, this is going to be your myosin, your thick filaments. Purple is your actin, your thin filaments. These strands here, the yellow strand here, that's tropomyosin, and the green one is troponin. So what happens that when the muscle is relaxed, you see these deep purple bits, they are covered over by tropomyosin. Okay? So when calcium is released, the calcium that's released attaches to troponin, the green. It changes the shape of troponin. When the shape of troponin changes, it moves the tropomyosin away. Okay, so it then reveals these purple bits, and these purple bits are the only part of the actin that the myosin can bind to. Okay, so the purple bits here, that's the only part of the actin that the myosin can bind to. So when the myosin can bind to these deep purple bits, then it can cause the sarcomere to shorten. Okay, all right. But like I said, the video will explain that again. But I'll just say it one more time. Calcium gets released as a result of electrical activity from the nervous system. The calcium attaches to these green bits called troponin. The troponin moves the tropomyosin, which was covering the specific binding sites. Because the binding sites are now exposed, myosin can attach to it and start to cause the muscle to contract and shorten. Okay. But like I said, when you see the video, when I send you these links and you watch the video and the audio and the video combined, it will make a lot more sense. But I'll remember to send you that link. Okay. Okay. And then this, I think, definitely comes up in your workbook, the all or none, all or nothing law. So firing a nerve within a motor unit generates the stimulus needed to fully contract all the associated muscle fibers. Okay? So in other words, when you get an electrical signal from a nerve for a muscle to contract, all of those muscle fibers that are innervated will contract fully or not at all. Okay, so they won't contract partially. Okay? So all the muscle fibers in a motor unit, when stimulated to contract, will contract fully. Okay, so when an impulse is sent down a neuron, all the muscle fibers within that motor unit will be innervated. The motor unit will activate all its fibers or none. That's the all or none law, or the all or none principle. All of the muscle fibers that are innervated by a motor unit will contract fully or not at all. Nice and straightforward. Okay, so the motor is either on or it's off. There's no halfway house. It doesn't innervate some of its fibers. It's either all of them and they're switched on fully, or none of them. Okay. And then finally, let's look at how exercise can enhance neuromuscular connections. Neuromuscular connections just means the connection between the nervous system and the muscular. So neuro means it always relates to nerve, and obviously we know muscular relates to the muscles themselves. Okay. So short-term and immediate effects of exercise on your neuromuscular system. So we have increased muscle temperature and pliability. Okay. Remember, this is not talking specifically about nerves. We're just talking about the neuromuscular system, that combination. Okay, so obviously, as we're working out, we know our muscle temperature will increase and they become more pliable. In other words, we're able to stretch them further. We have increased power outputs, increased nerve to muscle link. So when you start to work out, and when you're warming up and you do your first set of a lift, for example, what you're doing, you're improving the connection between the nervous system and the muscles. So some of you who do regular resistance training, you might notice that, let's say you're doing, no, let's say something like push-ups, for example. Some of you may notice that your second set of push-ups feels more comfortable than your first set. Your first set, what you're doing with your first set, you're actually priming the nervous system, the neuromuscular system. You're priming it, waking it up, and that's why your second set is generally better than your first set. Okay, so that's what you're doing. You're priming and increasing the relay of electrical activity from your nerves to your muscles, and you have an increased recruitment of muscle fibers. Okay, so again, that's exactly what happens when you're working out in short term. As you work out, you're improving the amount of muscle fibers that are going to be recruited by the nervous system. And that's why, again, first set tends to be your primer. Second, third, fourth set tend to be the ones where you're far more effective. Because now you've woken up the nervous system and able to innervate as many fibers as possible. Okay, that's in the short term. Long term, okay, so pretty much the results of all your hard work, you'll have increased muscular endurance and or hypertrophy. So remember, muscular endurance is the ability for the muscle to contract repeatedly without undue fatigue. And the hypertrophy is about increasing muscle size. Okay. Increased storage of glycogen and creatine phosphate in the muscles. We're going to talk about glycogen and creatine phosphate in the afternoon webinar because that's to do with energy systems. Increase in contractile proteins, actin and myosin. So we mentioned actin and myosin, actin being your thin filament, it's a protein, as is myosin, and they're your contractile proteins. So remember, they're the ones that cause the sarcomere to shorten. Increased basal metabolic rates, that's the ability to burn calories at rest. Okay? So your basal metabolic rate is the rate at which you burn calories when you are just simply resting, doing absolutely nothing. Okay. We do touch on basal metabolic rate when we do the level 3 stuff. Okay. Improved posture, increase in size and number of capillaries. So your capillaries, they're the site at which we have gases exchange. So if you remember from, I think it was last week, we talked about the cardiorespiratory system. You have your arteries, and they divide into smaller structures called arterioles, and then they divide into smaller structures called capillaries. Okay, and then those capillaries are embedded within the tissues, and that's where we have an exchange of nutrients. So all the good stuff in and all the bad stuff out. So that's what happens at the capillaries, and they are single cell thick. And then we have increased neuromuscular connections leading to improvement in skill and motor related fitness. So when you are training and you're doing something repeatedly, you're improving things like your coordination, agility, balance, coordination, etc., as a result of improved connections. Okay? And that's exactly how you improve your skill, by repeating things. By repeating something, it's not just repetition that improves your coordination. What you're actually doing is training the nervous system. That's what you're doing. But training the nervous system, because remember, your muscles will only contract as a result of input from the nervous system. If you are repeating a pattern of movement, it only improves because you're training the nervous system to allow the nerves to fire in the correct pattern to allow that movement to occur. Okay? And a prime example of that is balance. Okay? If you have poor balance, but you work on balance exercises, it's not that you can suddenly stand there like that. You're training the nervous system to allow the nerves to send the impulses to the muscles in the right way to allow you to be able to do that balance. Anything that involves a skill, again, you're training the nervous system to allow it to send signals to the muscle in the right order, if you like, to allow that particular skill to occur. And that's why you improve through repetition. Okay, if you're trying to improve a skill, repetition, training the nervous system is what allows you to improve that skill. Okay. Right. Go to there it is. Okay. Can someone just confirm that you can see the learner workbook? Someone can just confirm that for me, please?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cool. Right. So you'll see that you've only got 4 questions. So describe the role and functions of the nervous system. Integration response. Okay. So those will certainly be things that must feature in here. Okay. Describe the principles of muscle contraction. So that's going to link to the slide that I will send you. Okay. So that's where we talked about the sliding filament theory. So you must include the term sliding filament theory in your answer, but don't just leave that, because that's not sufficient. Okay. So things like the term sliding filament theory must feature in this answer here for task 2, and then you now need to talk about actin, myosin, cross-bridge formation. You need to talk about sarcomas. Okay, so all of that needs to be featured in here. It is in your manual, but again, the YouTube video that I'll send you the link to, that will help you with this. Explained it all or nothing law. So remember, we just looked at that. That's talking about the fact that when the muscle fibers of a motor unit are stimulated, all of those fibers will contract or none at all. So that's quite a simple one to answer. And then identify how exercise can enhance neuromuscular connections and improve motor fitness. So that was the last slide. Okay, the last slide. So just use that last slide to help you answer this one. Okay, so this is a very, very easy workbook to pass. Okay, just those 4 questions. So all of that is going to be within the slides that I'm going to send you. And then, like I said, just have a look at the YouTube video. I'll send you 2 links, 2 different YouTube videos. You don't need to watch both of them. One of them is a little bit probably geared more towards a student, a young student, whereas the other one is perhaps geared towards someone who's, I don't know, starting at a higher level. So probably watch both and see which one works best for you. Okay. So are there any questions about what we've just covered? Okay, cool. So in the next half an hour or so, I will send you the slides and the link, and I will send you, let you know exactly what your homework is for this week. If you don't receive that email with the homework and the slides and link, if you don't receive that by 10:30, if you don't receive that by 10:30, let me know. Okay, because I'm aware that sometimes when I send stuff, not all of you are getting it, even though I've got all your email addresses in the address bar. Somehow you're not always getting it. So if you don't receive that from me by 10:30, send me an email and let me know, and I will resend it. Okay. Cool. So thank you for attending this webinar, and look out for the link for the afternoon one, which is at 2 o'clock, and that's to do with energy systems. Okay. So thank you for attending, and I'll see you all later on.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.